Thanks, Dennis and Annette and everyone for organizing this conference. My act is logically following Manuel's, expanding evidence for Anadenanthera in the Andes. I guess I don't need to say this since Manuel just talked about this, but Anadenanthera is the genus of trees, leguminous trees from South America that whose seeds are rich in psychoactive alkaloids, primarily bufotenine. And in addition to being one of the more widespread and anciently used plants in the Andes, it's also quite versatile in how it's been administered, from reports of chewing the seeds directly to toasting and grinding it into a powder and administering it as a snuff, or as Manuel alluded to, drinking orally. And previous research has identified evidence from a variety of different sources, ranging from chemical residue analysis of artifacts to actual botanical specimens being recovered. Snuffing paraphernalia has been found in abundance, and iconography has also been identified, which represents the plant. And often these categories of evidence overlap as well. My research focused on the iconography aspect, so that's what I'll be talking about. As a sort of overview of spatial and temporal time, this is what the map of Peru and some major pre-Columbian cultures looks like. So I'll be talking about the Cupisnique, Paracas, and Nazca. I chose to focus on those cultures because those were those societies that previously exhibited no evidence for the use of vilca. I'll briefly mention Chavin and Moche as previous research on those topics, and then Manuel did a great job of covering Tiwanaku and Wari. Okay, so Cupisnique is this north coast culture from the early or middle to late formative period times, but that's early in pre-Columbian history. And scholars have long noted that its iconography has been dominated by surreal and supernatural imagery. However, there's been no evidence of specific depictions of Anadenanthera. Before I dive into that, I'll set the context for why we think Anadenanthera logically would have belonged in Cupisnique culture. And so I'll first examine the contemporaneous culture of Chavin, which existed in the same time period as Cupisnique, and then also the Moche culture, which existed in a similar spatial area to Cupisnique, but in a later time period. Chavin, known for its highland ceremonial center of Chavin de Huantar, is located in the central highlands of Peru. And it's this large ceremonial complex that was constructed right at the merging together of these two rivers. It's underground is composed of these weaving labyrinth tunnels, and that's eventually leading to this main stone obelisk called the Lançon. And we've had an abundance of evidence accumulated over the years that not only for plants being depicted in the iconography, but images of shamanic transformation, anthropomorphism, and ceremonial procession, like the blowing of these conch shells or the labyrinth itself. More recent studies by John Rick at Stanford, he did an acoustical analysis of these tunnels and found that they were resonating system, like they were acoustically resonant. And interestingly, the water from the nearby river was engineered to be diverted into canals in this underground system that would have produced this echoing, resonating sound of rushing water. So I like this quote. He says, "They were using hydraulics, acoustics, mirrors, psychoactive drugs. They made water dance and sing by its motion through the canals." And the evidence for the Anadenanthera plant, specifically at Chavian-Duantar, the stone tablet really has features of all of the major botanical features from the leaves to the seed pods, adorned on a shamanic anthropomorphized figure. We also see images of intense mucus flow and nasal discharge, which, as Manuel said, is one of those effects of inhaling the snuff. Now moving to the Moche culture, which is at a much later time period, but also on the north coast, we have an abundance of evidence for the depiction, a very naturalistic, realistic drawings of the Anadenanthera plant in the whole form. And interestingly, these are always carved onto stirrup spout drinking vessels. Now, coupled with the fact that we have virtually no evidence that smoking or snuffing was occurring on the north coast, this suggests that the likely method of administration for Vilca in Moche time was as an oral beverage. Now, moving back to Cupisnique, but given this context in which similar related cultures used Vilca, what do we see in Cupisnique? Well, what scholars have previously noted was the depiction of psychoactive plants like San Pedro cactus, images of shamanism, and actually even the bodily experiences of altered states of consciousness. And like I mentioned, the San Pedro cactus is probably, I think Cupisnique is like the most ancient cultural evidence for its depiction iconographically. But Vilca was still lacking. There was no evidence. So that was our mission, to try and identify it in the iconography of Cupisnique. In order to do that, of course, you have to appreciate the botanical morphology of the plant itself. And those traits include symmetrical opposite leaves, spherical flowers, and long wavy edge seed pods, along with the irregularly rounded seeds themselves. However, it's not always that simple. Obviously, much of pre-Columbian art is highly stylized, and so previous research, like by Manuel and other scholars, have noted these features or symbols that are known to represent the Anadenanthera plant in other cultures where its use is more established. So for the leaves, it's often represented as the triangular symmetrical shape, flowers as these paired inscribed circles, and the seed pods as a linear column of connected circles. And in our investigations, we found evidence for all these features being depicted in various ways. So we see this symmetrical chevron shape etched into the sides of some ceramics. We see the seed pod motif being the stacked circles on these drinking vessels, also supporting the evidence from Moche that it was associated with drinking vessels. But perhaps most convincingly is when you appreciate not just the botanical morphology itself, but when these motifs appear in a context of shamanic use and shamanic themes, like animal transformation. So this serpent image, I think, is really interesting. I call this the legume pod motif of this connected column of circles, but I always find it attached to the body of the serpent. To me, this suggests, given that the pre-Columbian cultures had an animistic worldview in which they perceived their they perceive their environment as a relationship of subjective personhoods, that this would have been a strong association between the serpent and the seed pod, not as a random coincidence, but as a meaningful correlation. In the same way that modern shamans in the Amazon may say something like, the mother of ayahuasca, which is this weaving vine, is a serpent. And so I think that what we're seeing here with this motif, always associated with serpent imagery, is the Cupisnique's artists' attempts to convey that they viewed this plant and this animal as parallels or perhaps even equivalents. Now this column of circles, another common motif is the individual circles broken down and scattered throughout an image. And to us, we'd like to suggest that this represents the individual seeds rather than the seed pod as a whole. And supporting this interpretation is we find this motif represented on those large monoliths at Tiwanaku on the base, the inscribed circle motif, and at Chavin associated with the jaguars on the skin of the jaguar motif. And it's well known that this belief that the ingestion of these substances could transform one into a jaguar, as Glenn talked about earlier in the day, we see this being depicted in pre-Columbian times very vividly at Chavin de Wantar, where you have these stone heads that represent progressive stages of transformation from human to animal. And so when we look at Cupisnique art, we see this, we always see on these jaguars this Vilca seed motif, as we're calling it. Well, previous scholars have simply written this off as, oh, it's just representing the spots of the jaguar. But this doesn't fit with what we know about Cupisnique art. As I mentioned, they're clearly not concerned with realism or naturalism, but much more with the symbolic and supernatural depictions. And so, again, given this animistic worldview in which different identities could be exchanged between human, plant, and animal, coupled with the fact that when these substances are ingested, often the one is faced or encounters these animals in the visions, I think this reinforces this parallelism or similarity between similarly shaped forms, whether it's the seed pod resembling the serpent or the individual seeds resembling the spots of the jaguar. So I think this is very interesting, not only as evidence of Vilca, but a glimpse into the animistic worldview and perceptions of these ancient people. We also see evidence of acts of shamanic practice, like pouring a liquid into a drinking vessel. This is a very interesting image, as it suggests that they were drinking, consuming something orally. And this figure in particular is covered with esoteric carvings on their back, pursed lips, which suggest singing, and also eyes rolled to the back of their heads, which indicates a trance state, as we see at Chavin as well. All of these pieces of evidence combined suggest that what we're looking at here is a shamanic image of perhaps drinking the Vilca. I love these ceramic images of depicting the actual bodily sensations of these states of consciousness induced by these substances. And I found this quote from Schultes where he describes the effects of Vilca as the world being turned upside down and that men are walking on their feet in the air. And this is precisely what we are seeing in these Cupisnique ceramics. Okay, so that was the evidence in Cupisnique. And now we're moving to the south coast of Paracas, looking for similar motifs of Vilca represented there. This was a similar time period, but much further south on the coastal deserts. And Paracas was well known for their elaborate and large textiles, which often served the function of being bundle wrappings for their mummy burials. And on these textiles, on these fragments, we found images of these same legume pod motifs of Vilca. This is perhaps the best example because it not only contains this legume pod motif throughout the image, but the figure is holding a snuffing tube, as you can see there. And dotted around the images are also the star shape, which we've noted as representing the San Pedro cactus. You also have this clear juxtaposition, or this upside down facing figures and symmetry that we see at the Raimondi stela at Chavin. So all these pieces of evidence indicate the shamanic use of the psychoactive plant. On some textile fragments, we see this image that was previously described as the so-called ecstatic shaman. And magical flight is this theme of shamanism that has been written about as, I guess, leaving one's body or departing to a new world. But although scholars have written about this ecstatic shaman, or the so-called oculate being with the large eyes, there is never any knowledge about the actual plants or substances that this shaman was using. But in our studies, we found that certain textile examples where this legume pod motif was being represented alongside these flying shamans, and also one example of again, the bifurcated snuffing tube being held. And so to us, this is evidence of the use of Vilca in the Paracas culture. And again, this legume pod motif association with the serpents is clearly evident in Paracas times as well. You almost always see this chain of interconnected circles within the body of a serpent, which indicates like I said before, this parallelism between associating this animal, the shamanic animal, with the shamanic plant. And I just threw this in here. I don't know. I think there's some resemblance here to the so-called palpa lines that have been carved into the hillsides in the desert. Again, this line of circles with the face appended on it as a serpent. Very close resemblance to some of these textiles that are including Anadenanthera. And then the last culture that I focused on was Nazca, which occupied the south coast, basically the same geographical region as the Paracas culture, directly following them. And a lot of their traditions and beliefs and practices were adopted as well. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that we found these same motifs being depicted in artifacts coming from Nazca as well for the first time. This textile here has all the botanical motifs of Anadenanthera, from the symmetrical triangles representing the leaf, snuffing tube being held, the paired circles, which is a common motif at Tiwanaku, representing the flowers of Anadenanthera, and this column of the interconnected circles representing the seed pods, anthropomorphic transformation, the twisted head, all of these pieces of evidence going together, supporting the interpretation that these images are conveying that Nazca were clearly familiar with these states. We also find them not only on textiles in Nazca, but now appearing on ceramics as well. Again, this association between the Vilca motifs and the jaguar and the serpent image still persisting into later time periods in Nazca. And well, I like this jaguar image in particular because here it's quite clear that it's not a naturalistic depiction of the spots, but rather this connected circles representing the seed pods. This image from the Nazca culture really captures everything in a single piece. We found the serpent lined with the column of circles representing the Anadenanthera seeds, the triangular chevron shape representing the leaves, these cacti as a whole, as well as the star-shaped slices, all being shown on a Nazca vessel. And to us, this is quite convincing, and it also has resemblance to like Wari vessels, where we know they were using a Vilca. And so, given all this together, I think we have convincing evidence that Anadenanthera was at least being depicted by the Nazca culture. And clearly, the amount of time and effort to create these ceramics or textiles and other examples would have required an enormous amount of time and energy to create. So these weren't something you can just make over the weekend. I mean, it's like a substantial part of these artisans' lives are devoted to creating these highly intricate artistic creations. And so what they choose to depict in these creations is clearly a reflection of that which is important and significant to them. So that's sort of the summary of my overview of we found evidence of Anadenanthera on the north coast to the south coast from the formative period up until later time periods in Nazca. All this combined with helps to fill in the gaps in our knowledge for the use of Anadenanthera in the pre-Columbian Andes. And it goes to show just how widespread and important this plant was in pre-Columbian times. The fact that it was so pervasive over geography and of many thousands of years is an indication of its cultural significance. So I have to give, thank you. And I want to give thanks to my advisor, Christine Hasdorf at Berkeley, who really guided me through this research project, and Kathy Costin, who I collaborated with on the Cupisnique analysis, and she really provided me with all those images, so these would have been impossible without these two. And thank you all.
All right, do we have any questions?
Yes.
Straight to the front.
Well, thank you, Colin. That was very interesting. Very interesting look at all this iconography. It seems quite convincing. You see these same themes going through all of these different cultures. I guess I have two questions. One of them is related to that those vessels that you showed toward the end of your talk, and that seems to be very clearly, it incorporates all these themes. Are those drinking vessels, you think, or does that imply that this is a beverage, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're clearly liquid, designed to contain a liquid as they're drinking it, but I don't know if we can say that they were drinking it from that. But
These are in museums someplace?
yeah, these are all in museums. We were initially going to do like chemical residue analysis of these vessels, which would have provided even clearer evidence of this Anadenanthera being used, but museums don't like you touching their...
That would have nailed it down, of course, the one piece of information you need.
Yeah.
My other question is, other people must have looked, other archaeologists and archaeohistorians must have looked to these striking images. So what's the response been? Are you being denounced or are you being praised? Or it's like, oh, he's ridiculous. He sees Anadenanthera everywhere. You know, I mean, have you gotten any response from the archaeological community, either negative or positive, about their interpretations?
Yeah, it's been positive. I mean, a lot of this imagery has been just not considered before. No one's written, like, people will say, literally describe these motifs as a chain or a column of circles and give no thought into what their meaning or significance is. And so when I found the motifs associated with all these shamanic themes of transformation and paraphernalia, I think that helps strengthen the argument of that they appeared in context. But yeah, the response has been good. I've published a paper and peer-reviewed, and it got accepted and presented at the Society of American Archaeology. So yeah, it's been good.
So basically, it's people that are not familiar with botanical morphology, you know, so it would never occur to them to relate these motifs to the, you know, pretty distinct characteristics of Anadenanthera, the leaves, the seeds, and so
That's right. It's highly
They're
stylized.
not botanists or archaeobotanists, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. It's highly stylized in many of these cases where it doesn't really resemble the plant. And in those cases where it does resemble the plant, like the moche, it has been identified for decades. But in these more symbolic forms of representing the plant, you really have to appreciate that, the symbology, and then also you have to build the argument by understanding the context in which it appears, which is often with the shamanic themes.
Yeah, well, it's convincing to me, but then I'm biased, so, but it's wonderful, great conversation.
I actually have a question as well. In your first slide, or in the beginning of the slides, I saw enema as a method of intake. What evidence do you have for enema? Because it's fascinating, because that is a medical function that we don't hear too much about.
Yeah, it's of the actual paraphernalia, like the bone, like, what are they called? Spatulas, I suppose, that you would use to administer it. Those have been recovered as artifacts.
You're familiar with Peter de Smet's work on this, the Dutch ethnopharmacology, wrote a whole book in like mid-90s called Ritual Enemas and Snuffs in the New World.
I'm actually not, no.
You know that book?
No.
Well, that's it. I mean, I don't know. It must be out of print, but that was Peter de Smet, who later, sort of changed his direction toward herbal medicines and is known in that world. But he wrote this remarkable book called Ritual Enemas and Snuffs in the New World, and showed a lot of this iconography. And if you can get your hands on that book, it's probably going to cost you, but buy it because it's very valuable.
Okay, thanks.
And very good work.
Any questions?
No, I was wondering, I just type snakes of coastal Peru, and look at this, It is very similar, to what you're showing.
Yes.
So have you looked through the snakes and all this? Because maybe it is not Anadenanthera, maybe it's a representation of these snakes, you know, and it's
Yeah.
very, very, very similar.
Yes, I looked at that, and also, of course, with the jaguar example, it looks very similar, and that has been the common interpretation. But the fact that sometimes it's connected as this column of circles with the interconstrictions, this is very specific to the Vilca seed pods. That's not exactly what it looks like. But it's, yeah, if that was the basis of the argument, I agree, that would be quite weak. But it's the fact that all these multiple motifs appear in combination with each other, like not just the botanical motifs, but the paraphernalia and the anthropomorphic transformation. I think when you consider all of these together, it supports that the overall intent of the image was to convey the use of Anadenanthera.
I know in Mexico, Cameron McNeil at, I think she's at NYU, has had success at recovering from the inside of vessels, drinking vessels, trace scrapings that you can then do analyses on, mass spectrometry and stuff, and identifying ritual beverages like cacao and so on. I wonder has there ever been any attempt to recover to figure out what the contents, what would have been drunk in these vessels? Is that been done, or is it possible?
It's definitely possible. That was our initial plan, actually. I'm not sure if it's been done in the ceramic drinking vessels, but there's been a number of studies that have analyzed the snuffing trays, but then also the pouches recovered from further south in the desert. Just in the past few years, they found ritual snuffing bag and found traces of all these substances.
But no one's ever found, say, DMT or beta-carbolines in a drinking vessel.
Correct.
But you're looking.
I think that's the next step to prove this, yes.
Okay.
Would you say that there is enough evidence at this point, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Torres too, but to imagine that Anadenanthera might have been mixed in with the San Pedro beverage, based on that last Nazca vessel with both San Pedro and Anadenanthera?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't know, and I don't want to say that just based on the iconography, but I think the iconography provides an anecdotal suggestion that that possibility should be tested chemically. That's what I'll say.
San Pedro ferments too.
And when San Pedro ferments, it works much different and really potent some of his characteristics. As Manuel talks about the chicha, the molle with an Anadenanthera and wari, there is not much evidence because we lost part of the story on time, but as I cooked San Pedro a long time, and sometimes accidentally, but later learning how to manage fermentation on San Pedro, the possibility to ferment some Wilca seeds on San Pedro sounds amazing.
Do you know if the fermentation itself produces beta-carbolines?
I'm not sure, but produced really nice effects.
Hi, Colin. Thank you very much for your talk. It was great. I wanted to ask if, when we saw the iconography from Nazca, there was snuffing paraphernalia painted on, as Dennis was mentioning, drinking, bottles, drinking containers. But when we look at the first culture that you, first era, in the Cupisnique, thank you, I couldn't remember the name of it. In Cupisnique, we're not seeing any paraphernalia associated to snuffing. What happens, is it common, for example, in Tiwanaku and others, for there to be snuffing paraphernalia depicted on drinking vessels, or would it normally be separate according to use?
I can't really, yeah, I think it would be separate. I can't really, most of the depictions of snuffing are on textiles or on snuffing tablets.